Chapter 1, Episode 1, The Prosperity of the Capital. March of the year 686, corresponding to March of the second year of Chuigong, in front of the main gate of the imperial palace in divine capital Luoyang. A massive square object was placed here, oriented toward the four cardinal directions, east, west, south, and north. Painted in four distinct colors, red, black, white, and green, it attracted countless onlookers. Even the soldiers guarding the imperial palace gate did not intervene or disperse the crowd. At this moment, a group of eunuchs and palace maids surrounded Queen Victoria as they approached the palace gate. One of the eunuchs stepped forward to publicly read an imperial decree. The eunuch who read the decree was Oliver Reed. After the death of the internal palace junior supervisor, Wren Pennington, Oliver had taken over the position, serving as the voice of Queen Victoria to issue commands and summons. Clearing his throat, he used the high-pitched, characteristic voice of a eunuch to loudly proclaim, "By the mandate of heaven, Victoria decrees, to broaden the avenues of discourse and sincerely welcome talented individuals from all corners of the realm, a four-colored petition box has been established in front of the imperial palace of Luoyang. Its purposes are as follows. First, to expose lawbreakers. Second, to allow virtuous talents to recommend themselves. Any citizen of the realm, regardless of status or rank, may submit letters into this box. If the content is verified as truthful, the court will reward the individual generously. Even if the content proves untrue, no punishment will be administered. Furthermore, anyone who comes forth will be provided with travel expenses, food, and lodging by the court." After the decree was read, the gathered crowd erupted into murmurs of discussion. Oliver Reed glanced at Queen Victoria, who appeared very satisfied, and then stepped back. At this moment, a young official dressed in blue robes stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "I am Thomas Fisher, son of Imperial Censor Gregory Fisher. This four-colored petition box was designed by me. Now, I shall explain its usage to you all. This box comprises four independent compartments, each with a slot at the top for inserting letters. The green box to the east is for self-recommendation letters. If you believe you possess talent, you may recommend yourself. Once verified, if true, the court will immediately appoint you to a suitable position. The white box to the west is for grievances. If you have been wronged, you may write a petition and place it in this box. The black box to the north is for denunciations. If you discover or know of lawbreakers, you may submit a denunciation letter here. Once verified as truthful, the court will not only reward you, but may also grant you an official position." He paused briefly before continuing. "The red box to the south is for suggestions regarding state governance. These letters will be reviewed by designated officials, and if deemed beneficial, they will be presented to Queen Victoria for consideration." Upon hearing this explanation, the crowd erupted into animated discussions. At this point, a robust man in the crowd asked, "What if it's just a suspicion, and after verification, it turns out to be untrue? Will there be punishment?" Many nodded in agreement, echoing the question. Thomas Fisher immediately replied, "Of course not. If you have the determination and courage to expose wrongdoers, how could the court punish you? Even if the denunciation proves untrue, it doesn't matter." Another person then asked, "Does this mean anyone can come forward to make a denunciation?" Thomas Fisher nodded affirmatively and said, "As long as you are a person, whether a prisoner in jail or a bandit in the mountains, if you wish to make a denunciation, you may come here. No one is allowed to stop you, and the court will even provide you with food, lodging, and travel expenses." These words immediately caused a stir among the crowd. Thomas Fisher looked toward Queen Victoria, and upon receiving her approval, ordered the decree to be posted everywhere. Among the crowd, a young scholar dressed in white robes mustered his courage and stepped forward to inspect this mysterious box. Unable to contain his curiosity, he asked, "What exactly is this thing?" Suddenly, from the crowd behind, a low but clear voice replied, "This is an object that can change a person's destiny." The young man quickly turned his head to search for the voice, only to see an old man wearing a straw hat, who had already turned and walked away. Oliver Reed stepped forward and said, "The letters you submit today will be sent to the inner court and reviewed at midnight tonight. If they are of value, they will immediately be presented to Victoria, and the court will respond to you by tomorrow." The young man in white asked, "Does that mean I don't need to pass the imperial examination to become an official?" Oliver Reed was momentarily stunned upon hearing this. At that moment, Queen Victoria, who was seated on a soft couch, stood up and coldly said, "Ask him his name. To be so confident, he must be talented?" Oliver Reed quickly grabbed the young man and loudly asked, "What is your name to be so bold?" The young man in white was startled and tried to retreat, but the eunuch held him firmly. He then said, "I am Charles Justice, just joking." At this moment, Thomas Fisher also stepped forward and said, "If you are so confident, you can submit a self-recommendation letter into the green box. If you truly have talent, the court will certainly make you an official." Oliver Reed released his grip and said, "All right, Charles Justice, I'll remember your name. I want to see what talents you possess." The people around laughed at him, and Charles Justice blushed, quickly squeezing out of the crowd. A young servant, about 13 or 14 years old, hurried after him, calling, "Young master, wait for me." He was so focused on running with his head down that he accidentally bumped into a young girl. He quickly looked up to apologize, only to see the girl wearing a short green cotton dress. She appeared to be about his age, but her eyes were large and bright. She said, "Wow, you scholars read holy books, but can't even watch where you're going?" The young servant also caught up and apologized. "My young master didn't mean it. Please forgive him, miss." The young girl covered her mouth and laughed, saying, "How amusing. I'll go call my lady to come and see." With that, she turned and left. Charles Justice stared blankly at the girl's retreating figure. The young servant tugged at him and said, "Young master, you're daydreaming again? She's already gone." As soon as he finished speaking, his small head was tapped by his master. Charles Justice said, "Peter Justice, if you keep talking nonsense, I'll send you back home." Peter Justice, the young servant, quickly covered his mouth upon hearing this, while his master remarked, "This capital city is truly different. So many people, so many horses, so many carriages, and so much delicious food." Peter Justice whispered softly, "Yes, and so many beautiful women too." The master and servant duo walked south along the main road in front of the royal palace. They hadn't gone far when they heard someone calling from behind, "Charles Justice, wait a moment." Both thought to themselves, "Who could that be?" Turning around, they saw the robust man from earlier, now accompanied by a skinny fellow. The two hurried over and approached them, saying, "Young brother, we'd like to ask you to write a petition letter for us." Charles Justice responded, "Who do you want to file a complaint against?" The robust man quickly replied, "I want to file a complaint against the landlord Mora from our hometown." The skinny man beside him hastily added, "John Farmer, don't say anything yet. We need to wait until the young brother agrees to help us write the letter before we tell him." Charles Justice asked, "What has this landlord Mora done? Has he committed any wrongdoing?" John Farmer hurriedly explained, "Landlord Mora refuses to provide relief to us and mocks us for only knowing how to use violence." The skinny man chimed in, "Exactly. He's so wealthy, yet he's never willing to pay us extra wages. On top of that, he hired a very skilled martial arts master for his son. That martial arts master must be up to something suspicious." Charles Justice replied, "What you're saying doesn't sound credible. I cannot write a complaint letter for you. I also advise you not to write one yourselves. Without evidence, even if you do, the court won't believe it. John Farmer then exclaimed, Tom Shepherd, he won't write the complaint letter for us. What should we do now? The sick man, hearing this, unhappily said, John Farmer, I've told you already, don't call me by that lowly name in front of others. He then turned to Charles Justice and said, It's all right, young man, just write it. Even if it's not true, the court won't hold us accountable. Moreover, they'll provide us with food, lodging, and travel expenses. Charles Justice sternly replied, Falsely accusing others harms one's moral virtue. I won't do such a thing. The young servant, Peter Justice, added, That's right. My master would never do something so disgraceful. Please leave. Hearing this, the two men were visibly displeased. John Farmer angrily said, If you won't write for us, I'll find someone else who will. You're not the only one in the world who knows how to write. Watch yourself. Don't let me see you again. With that, he clenched his fist menacingly. Peter Justice quickly pulled his master away. Tom Shepherd complained, Joe Eyre, you're being reckless again. Acting so aggressive will only scare people off. Chilean protested, Who says this young man won't help us write a secret report? By now, it was almost noon, and the stomachs of both master and servant were growling. Peter Justice said, Young master, are you hungry? I'm starving. Let's go get something to eat. Charles Justice quickly felt his purse, pulled it out, and counted. There were only 30 coins left. He said, We came to the capital to visit my uncle, but who would have thought his entire family had moved away? Now, we only have 30 coins left. I'm afraid it won't even cover lodging. Peter Justice hurriedly replied, Young master, in that case, we should return home as soon as possible. If we run out of money, we won't even have a way to get back. Charles Justice said firmly, No, I'm not going back. What's so great about home? Every day, it's just reading books and practicing martial arts. It's so boring. Peter Justice quipped, And yet, they still haven't made you work in the fields. Charles Justice declared, I must accomplish something great in the capital, and only then will I return home in glory. Peter Justice said, But we have no connections here, no one to rely on. How can we achieve anything grand? Hearing this, Charles Justice lowered his head thoughtfully. Suddenly, he exclaimed, I have an idea. We can throw a letter into the box at the palace gates. Peter Justice, puzzled, asked, Young master, didn't you say that secret reporting was an immoral act, something you'd never do? Charles Justice smacked him on the head and said, Fool! Who said I was going to make a secret report? I'm going to submit a self-recommendation letter. With that, he found an empty spot by the roadside, instructed his servant to take out the 4 treasures of the study, and began grinding ink to write his letter of self-recommendation. Once the letter was written, the two of them returned to the palace gates. The crowd of onlookers had grown even larger. Charles squeezed through the throng to the front. Although the minor officials were anxiously waiting, no one had yet thrown a letter. Summoning all his courage, Charles held the letter in his sweaty hands, and slowly approached the eastern copper railing. Just as he was about to throw it in, a minor official suddenly stood up, startling him. His hand trembled, and the letter fell to the ground. He quickly bent down to pick it up, only to be stopped by an official. Charles looked up in a panic and saw Thomas Fisher picking up the letter. Do you truly wish to submit a self-recommendation? Very well. As the first person to submit a letter, there will be a reward. With that, Thomas Fisher threw the letter into the copper railing box. Charles's heart was pounding with anxiety. Thomas Fisher pulled a silver ingot from his sleeve, placed it in Charles's hand, and then raised their hands high for the crowd to see. he announced. "This silver ingot is a reward from the court for this young man. The imperial court always keeps its promises." Hearing this, Charles was both overjoyed and stunned. Clutching the silver tightly, he was too emotional to speak. A man dressed as a fisherman immediately shouted, "If I throw a letter now, will I get silver right away?" Thomas Fisher quickly gestured for the crowd to quiet down. Everyone fell silent, waiting for his response. Thomas Fisher explained, "Of course, it doesn't mean that if you throw a letter now, you'll get silver immediately. The silver just now was a special reward for the first person to submit a letter. If you submit a letter, the court will naturally reward you tomorrow." The crowd gathered to watch and listen, all turning their gazes toward Charles Justice with admiration. He looked happily at the crowd, but noticed the young lady he had just bumped into standing with another young lady, pointing in his direction. Quickly lowering his head, he softly asked, "Sir, may I leave now?" Thomas Fisher nodded and replied, "Of course you may leave. Just remember to come back here tomorrow morning for the response." Charles Justice promptly agreed, grabbed Peter Justice, and the two squeezed through the crowd to leave. As they exited, a young girl's voice called out, "You two, stop right there." Startled, the master and servant halted and turned around, only to see the girl in the green dress from earlier angrily shouting at them, "You bumped into me and think you can just leave like that?" Peter Justice hurriedly responded, "Didn't we already apologize to you?" At that moment, another young lady stepped out from behind the girl in green and gently said, "Lily Carter, they've already apologized. Don't make things difficult for them." Charles Justice instinctively looked toward the voice and was momentarily stunned. He saw a tall young lady dressed in a flowing white gown standing beside the girl in green. While the girl in green appeared somewhat frail, this other young lady had a graceful figure, adorned with light makeup, and wearing a deep red, low-cut outfit that revealed a fair expanse of skin in her chest. Her attire was luxurious, complemented by numerous accessories marking her as a wealthy noblewoman. The two locked eyes briefly before quickly lowering their gazes. Even Peter Justice stared wide-eyed. Lily Carter snapped, "What are you looking at? Haven't you ever seen a beautiful woman before?" With that, she tugged the noblewoman away, and the two walked off, chatting as they went. Lily Carter's voice could still be heard saying, "That guy is really lucky, getting a whole tael of silver." Charles Justice watched them leave, then called Peter Justice, and the two went off together to find a restaurant for a meal. Along the way, Charles Justice kept fiddling with the tael of silver in his hand. Seeing this, Peter Justice remarked, "Young master, can I touch that silver? I've never seen so much money before." Charles Justice generously replied, "Look at how rustic you are. Here, take it and have a look." But inwardly, he thought to himself, "Haven't I also never seen this much silver before?" Peter Justice carefully took the silver, held it up to examine it, and couldn't resist biting it. The act made him grimace in pain. Charles Justice quickly snatched the silver back and scolded, "Are you trying to eat silver instead of steamed buns?" Peter Justice explained, "I heard that gold can show bite marks when bitten, so I wanted to see if my teeth could leave marks on silver." Charles Justice inspected the silver, and indeed found Peter Justice's teeth marks on it. Charles Justice tucked the silver into his chest and said, "Now that we have money, we don't need to worry anymore." Peter Justice added, "Young master, since we have money now, can we finally have a good meal?" Charles Justice replied, "Sure, what do you want to eat?" As soon as the words were spoken, a man rushed forward from behind and bumped into him. He quickly steadied himself, but the man staggered and fell to the ground. From behind, someone shouted loudly, "Stop him! Don't let him escape!" The two master and servant were startled. They saw the man who had fallen was a man in his 30s, wearing a short robe and clean-shaven. The man grabbed the front of Charles Justice's shirt, stood up and shouted, "Don't block the way of a great man!" Then he forcefully pushed Charles. Seeing the man's arrogance, Charles quickly stepped aside to dodge while trying to free himself from the man's grip. He reached out to grab the man's arm, but unexpectedly, the man ducked under his arm and hurriedly ran forward. Two strong men chasing from behind arrived shortly after. Seeing the man had escaped, they grew furious. One of them, who had a mole at the corner of his mouth, grabbed Charles Justice by the collar, lifted him up, and angrily said, "Useless scholar! You couldn't even stop one person. I'll teach you a lesson to vent my anger." With that, he raised his fist, aiming for Charles Justice's face. Chapter 2, Episode 2, The Silver is Gone. The divine capital Luoyang was bustling and prosperous, attracting all kinds of people. Here, the most powerful and wealthy gathered, and it was not uncommon for an ordinary outsider to be bullied. As the saying goes, a mighty dragon cannot suppress a local snake. Although Charles Justice had practiced martial arts, being grabbed so arrogantly by the strongman and about to be punched, he quickly tilted his head to avoid the blow. At the same time, he used both hands to grab the strongman by the neck. A young man like him would not tolerate being bullied for no reason. The strongman was startled, feeling that this seemingly frail young man actually had considerable strength. Charles's grip tightened to the point where the man could barely breathe, his face turning red. The strongman's companion, seeing this, immediately reached out to grab the young man. Peter Justice, the servant boy, shouted loudly, "They're fighting! They're fighting!" Though Charles Justice's feet were off the ground, he used the opponent's force to lift himself, kicking away the hand of the other strongman. The one holding him let go, and Charles Justice also released his hands. Seeing the two strongmen, one panting heavily and the other clutching his hand in pain, unable to focus on him, Peter Justice quickly pulled his master, and the two ran for their lives down the main street. Behind them came the curses of the strongman who had been kicked. The master and servant ran 3 streets away before stopping, ensuring they were no longer being pursued. At that moment, an old man sitting at a roadside tea shop glanced in their direction. Peter Justice, gasping for breath, exclaimed, "Young master, you're incredible." Charles Justice, also out of breath, waved his hand and said, "Those two were unreasonable. There's no need to be polite with such people." Just then, they heard a soft female voice nearby. "Oh, it's you two again?" The two turned toward the voice, and saw a young lady in a white dress and another girl in green standing across from them, curiously watching. Lily Carter spoke. "What happened to you two? Why are you so out of breath?" Peter Justice quickly replied, "Just now, 2 ruffians bullied my young master, but my young master taught them a lesson in return." As he spoke, he glanced at the 2 girls. The girl in green appeared to be around the same age as the lady in white, but had a pointed chin. Her clothing was plain, and she wore no jewelry, though a faint scent of powder lingered around her. Charles Justice noticed his servant boy staring intently at the 2 young women, feeling a bit embarrassed. He scolded, "Peter Justice, stand to the side and stop talking so much." Lily Carter pouted and said, "I don't see you knowing how to teach others either. But you do look quite imposing when you're angry. Did someone chase you off?" Hearing his master being scolded, Peter Justice stepped aside, turned his back, but sneaked a glance at the 2 young ladies. Charles Justice adjusted his disheveled clothes and said, "Believe it or not, it's up to you." Then he looked towards the young lady. Because the distance was not far, this time he could see her more clearly. Her eyes were not as large as Lily Carter's, but they were bright and clear. She had a round face, delicate features, and fair rosy skin, not the pale white from makeup. A fresh fragrance emanated from her, leaving him momentarily dazed. Lily Carter immediately said, "Have you looked enough?" Be careful, or I'll have someone gouge your eyes out. Charles Justice quickly snapped out of it. The young lady said, Lily Carter, let's go. Suddenly, they heard a panicked shout from behind them. A man on the street yelled loudly, Move aside, everyone move aside. An urgent message from the court. The two young ladies quickly turned their heads and saw a horse galloping down the main street like the wind, causing pedestrians to hurriedly move aside. The two young ladies were instantly frightened. The messenger on the horse saw that the three of them hadn't moved out of the way and quickly pulled the reins, but it was too late. The young lady hurriedly pushed Lily Carter aside, and the horse's front hooves came down towards her. Peter Justice stood frozen in fear, his mouth agape. Suddenly, a white blur flashed, and the horse missed its step, letting out a long neigh. Its front hooves landed on the ground, coming to a stop. The messenger on the horse fell off due to the momentum. An old man drinking tea nearby quickly stood up to assist the messenger. Seeing him unconscious, the old man hurriedly instructed others to carry the messenger into the nearby tea house and lay him on a long bench. He began massaging the man. Lily Carter, now recovered from the shock, quickly went to find the young lady, only to see Charles Justice holding the young lady by her slender waist. She called out, Miss, are you all right? The young lady, finally regaining her composure, quickly removed the man's arm and, still shaken, bowed in gratitude, saying, Was it you who saved me just now? Charles Justice quickly replied, It seems so. Then he noticed her slightly heaving chest and quickly lowered his gaze. At this moment, Peter Justice also rushed over and said, Young master, it's good that you're okay. You scared me to death. Charles Justice quickly asked, Where is the rider? Peter Justice replied, An old man helped him into the tea house nearby for treatment. The young lady and Charles Justice were both surprised and hurried over to take a look. They saw the old man helping the soldier breathe steadily, then pressing on the Higu and Renjong acupoints. The soldier regained consciousness and quickly asked, Where is my horse? He then stood up. Peter Justice said, Your horse is on the main road. Why are you in such a hurry? The soldier quickly ran to his horse, mounted it, and said, I have military duties to attend to, and cannot afford any delay. The old man spoke again. Is this military pouch yours? He then raised a yellow cloth bag. The soldier quickly nodded in response. The old man tossed it over, and the soldier caught it, opened it, and found only a sealed military intelligence report inside. Bowing his hands in gratitude, he said, Thank you, before urging his horse to chase after his comrades. The old man calmly returned to his seat and resumed drinking tea. Lily Carter helped the young lady sit down and ordered a pot of tea from the shopkeeper. The young lady quickly expressed her gratitude, saying, Thank you, Scholar Justice, for saving my life earlier. Please, both of you, take a seat. Allow me to treat you to tea as a token of thanks. Charles Justice replied, Saving someone in need is an urgent matter. I didn't think much of it. Please, there's no need to be overly formal. Turning to his attendant, he said, Peter Justice, let's go. The young lady hurriedly stood up and said, My surname is Williams. My home is on East Market Street, right next to Clear Peace District. If you ever need assistance, please come find me there. I will certainly ask my father to help you. Charles Justice clasped his hands respectfully and said, In that case, thank you, Miss Williams. Until we meet again. He felt as though he had just played the role of a great hero or a knight rescuing a damsel in distress, so his words carried a chivalrous tone. Leaving Peter Justice, he left the tea shop at a brisk pace. Peter Justice, puzzled, asked, Miss Williams invited us to drink tea. Why didn't you stay, young master? Charles Justice replied, How could I shamelessly let them treat me? It should be the other way around. I should be treating them. Peter Justice countered. Regardless of who treats whom, why did you run off? Now that we're apart, how can we drink tea together? Charles Justice lamented. Because I just realized that the one tael of silver rewarded by the court is missing. Peter Justice, incredulous, asked, What? The silver is gone? The young master nodded solemnly. It's gone. I must have lost it while saving the young lady. No, wait. It must have been during the fight with those two thugs. The one who grabbed my clothes must be the thief. Peter Justice, still skeptical, said, A thief, yet brazen enough to act like that? Charles Justice replied, It must be. No wonder they didn't chase after us. This won't do. I have to go find them and get my silver back. The master and servant duo promptly returned to the scene of the earlier fight. The bustling street remained lively, but the two thugs were nowhere to be seen. They searched along the busy street, looking in all directions, but still couldn't find them. Peter Justice's stomach growled loudly from hunger, and Charles Justice, also feeling famished, counted the 30 copper coins left in his possession. If we eat, we can't afford lodging. If we lodge, we can't afford food. Peter Justice, what do you think we should do? Peter Justice suggested, In my opinion, we should go to Clear Peace District and find Miss Williams. After all, you saved her life, young master. If she doesn't repay the favor with her hand in marriage, at least she can help cover our travel expenses to get home. Charles Justice shook his head and said, No, a gentleman helps others without expecting repayment. How could we disturb a young lady in her home? Peter Justice said, Young master, I'm starving. How about we go to the temple on the outskirts of the capital for shelter? Charles Justice replied, No, I still have to wait for the court's response. Let's use these 30 coins to buy a meal. If the court doesn't hire me tomorrow, we'll still have enough for travel expenses. At worst, we can stay at the temple later. Peter Justice quickly nodded in agreement. The two master and servant found a small street and followed the strange aroma of pork, entering a small eatery. The owner, a man in his 40s, eagerly greeted them as they arrived and said, What would the two gentlemen like? Our specialty is pork. The two sat down and looked toward the counter, where a large iron pot simmered with pork, releasing the enticing aroma they had smelled earlier. Peter Justice gulped, and Charles Justice asked, The pork you're cooking smells amazing. How much is it? The shop owner replied, You have a keen eye, sir. This pork is slow-cooked with various spices and medicinal herbs, famous throughout the capital. Most customers buy it to take home, and only a few eat here. It's 50 coins per pound. Would you like half a pound? Charles Justice swallowed hard and said, All right, half a pound, and add 5 steamed buns. He calculated that 30 coins should be enough. The owner agreed and went to cut the pork. At that moment, a burly man in short sleeves entered, loudly saying, Owner, give me a pound of pork and a bottle of wine. He then chose an empty table and sat down. The master and servant turned to look, recognizing him as the man who had bumped into them earlier. The man also noticed them and was startled, but he maintained a calm expression and said, Oh, it's you too. My apologies for earlier. How about I treat you to this meal? Charles Justice was secretly pleased to hear this. Just then, an old man with a sword entered, also choosing an empty table and saying, Who's treating whom isn't clear yet. Let's not rush. The owner had finished cutting the pork and brought it out along with 5 steamed buns, greeting the old man as well. Charles Justice couldn't help but glance at the old man, who wore a straw hat that obscured his face. He then turned his gaze back to the burly man. The owner said, Mr. Ming, it seems you struck it rich again today, treating others to pork. The man called Ming quickly signaled to the owner to stop talking and serve the food. The owner understood and said to Charles Justice, Gentlemen, please enjoy your meal. Mr. Ming, our generous benefactor, is treating you, so no need to feel shy." The master and servant didn't understand what was going on, but, knowing the meal was a treat from the kind Mr. Ming, they were delighted and said, "Thank you." Ming watched as the owner brought out the wine and pork, poured himself a cup, and asked, "Would the young gentleman like a drink as well?" Charles Justice paused his ravenous eating, caught the scent of the wine, and nodded. "All right, just one cup," Peter Justice quickly said. "Young master, you're sneaking a drink again. If the old master finds out, you'll get punished." Charles Justice replied, "What's there to fear? My father isn't here. As long as you don't tell him, how would he ever know?" He then said to Ming, "My father drinks too. It's no big deal." Stevie poured him a cup of wine and said, "Brother, please enjoy." With that, he raised his own cup and drained it in one go. Charles Justice followed suit, tilting his head back to finish the drink, but immediately teared up from the spiciness. He hastily set the cup down and bit into a steamed bun to ease the heat. Seeing this, Stevie secretly chuckled and said, "Thank you for the honor, brother. How about another cup?" At that moment, the old man nearby muttered softly, "Spending someone else's money to treat others, truly no sense of loss, huh?" Stevie turned his head to look and saw the old man had taken off his straw hat, revealing a head of white hair. The man was focused on eating meat and drinking wine, as though he hadn't just made the remark. Stevie paid him no mind and said to Charles Justice, "It seems, brother, you're not from around here. Eat up. If it's not enough, order more. It's on me. Please make yourselves at home." Just then, the old man's hearty voice rang out again, "Feigning generosity, a hypocrite." Hearing this, Stevie immediately stood up. He despised being called a hypocrite more than anything. Striding over to the old man's table, he slammed his hand on it and shouted, "Old man, who are you calling a hypocrite? Are you tired of living?" Chapter 3, Episode 3, A Clash of Masters. The forest is vast, home to all kinds of birds and beasts. The capital is crowded, filled with all sorts of people. Charles Justice had just been rewarded with a tael of silver. Before he could even warm his pocket, it was stolen by a thief. Feeling dejected, he had no choice but to use the remaining 30 coins to settle the food expenses for himself and his young servant. Unexpectedly, at this small eatery, luck smiled upon him. Someone offered to treat them to a meal. Hearing that the meal was free, they immediately ordered 2 caddies of cooked meat and 20 steamed buns. The other diners in the restaurant looked at them and laughed, while the owner suspiciously asked, "You two ordered so much. Can you finish it all?" Charles Justice replied, "If we can't finish, we'll pack it up to take away. What's the problem? After all, it's this kind gentleman who's treating us." Peter Justice added, "Just in time, our young master doesn't have much money left." The old man carrying a sword coldly remarked, "Eating at someone else's expense and thinking you've struck gold. Haven't seen anyone as foolish as this." Stevie, hearing this, became furious and said, "The host hasn't even said anything, so what does it have to do with you? I advise you to mind your own business. Otherwise, my fists aren't just for decoration." The two were on the verge of clashing. Fearing they might fight and damage the shop, the restaurant owner quickly stepped in to mediate. The old man removed the iron sword from his back and placed it on the table. The sight shocked the owner, but Stevie remained unfazed and said, "Do you think flashing a rusty sword will scare anyone?" As he spoke, he flicked his headscarf, but suddenly a shadow darted past, and the scarf fell to the ground. Perplexed, he asked, "Why did my scarf fall? It was fine just a moment ago." Charles Justice quickly glanced at the old man and noticed that his sword had slightly emerged from its sheath. The blade was black yet emitted a faint glow. Peter Justice whispered to his master. "Young master, what are they arguing about? It seems to involve us." Charles Justice, equally puzzled, said, "That old man just called someone a fool. Could he mean us?" Peter Justice nodded. "It's possible." Charles Justice immediately stood up, clasped his hands in respect towards the old man, and said, "Senior, I have never met you before, and do not know how I might have offended you. Please enlighten me." The old man took a sip of wine, but before he could say anything, Stevie anxiously spoke up. "Shopkeeper, the bill, and pack up the leftover food to take away." As he spoke, he glanced nervously at the two of them. The old man said, "I noticed your clothing is quite plain. How could you possibly have a silver tail?" Charles Justice quickly replied, "That silver tail was a reward from a high-ranking official in the royal palace. I was the first to place a letter into the bronze box, so he rewarded me with a silver tail. Unfortunately, it was stolen from me." He suddenly exclaimed, "Senior, how do you know I had a silver tail? You must have been the one who stole it." Hearing this, Stevie secretly rejoiced. It turned out he was the one who had stolen Charles Justice's silver, but now that the old man had exposed it, he was worried the victim would realize. To his surprise, the victim was foolish enough to mistake the old man for the thief. The shopkeeper rolled his eyes and said, "Including the meal you treated these two young men to, the total is 515 coins. I'll round it down to 500 coins. Stevie immediately pulled out his money pouch, intending to pay. Unexpectedly, the old man drew his iron sword and, with a flick of his wrist, slashed Stevie's pouch. Silver and copper coins spilled all over the ground. Charles Justice quickly looked and instantly recognized the silver tail as his own. Seeing this, Stevie became furious and hurriedly bent down to pick up the scattered coins. The old man swung his sword, flipping the silver tail into the air and directing it toward Charles Justice. Stevie, seeing this, secretly clenched a handful of copper coins in his hand, preparing to use them as hidden projectiles. Charles Justice examined the silver tail carefully and said, "No doubt, this is my silver. It even has the bite mark from Peter Justice." He turned to Stevie and said, "So it was you who bumped into me and used the opportunity to steal my silver?" Stevie abandoned the packed food and quickly bolted out of the shop. Charles Justice turned to chase after him, but the old man hurriedly said, "Don't chase him." At that moment, Stevie flung 3 copper coins toward the old man's face. The old man swung his sword, deflecting the coins, and grabbed Charles Justice to stop him. Taking advantage of the moment, Stevie disappeared into the crowd outside the shop. Charles Justice, confused, asked, "Senior, why did you let that thief go?" The old man sheathed his sword and said, "Recovering the lost money is enough. No need to pursue too aggressively. If you provoke him, your life might be at risk." Charles Justice hurriedly clasped his hands in salute and asked, "Junior will remember the elder's advice. May I know your esteemed name?" The old man took another sip of wine and replied, "I am but a wanderer of the martial world, surnamed Gale, residing in Manhwa." Charles Justice immediately exclaimed, "Manhwa sect." Old Gale quickly gestured for him to lower his voice. "If you ever visit, you can look for me." He then turned to the innkeeper and said, "This money on the ground, along with the cost of my food and wine, should cover everything. From now on, don't let those petty thieves come here any more." The innkeeper gave a wry smile and said, "Guests are guests. Anyone with money is a patron. How could a small person like me dare to offend them?" Old Gale responded, "Fine, as you wish," and continued his meal. Charles Justice, however, was reluctant to leave. He asked, "Elder Gale, your martial arts are extraordinary. Would you consider taking me as your disciple? I have some experience in martial arts." Old Gale chuckled upon hearing this and replied, The little martial arts I know are not worth boasting about. You should seek a more capable master." Rejected, Charles Justice felt somewhat unwilling, but had no choice but to return to his seat and continue his meal. As they were about to leave, the old man added, "Young man, take care of yourself out there." Charles Justice quickly expressed his gratitude. He and his servant wandered aimlessly down the main road. Peter Justice then said, "Young master, we've recovered the silver. Let's find an inn to rest." "It's getting late," Charles Justice replied. "Staying at an inn isn't safe and costs money. Why don't we head to the temple on the outskirts and borrow a place to stay for the night? It's full of scholars and monks, much safer." Peter Justice agreed. "Then we'll follow your plan, young master." The two hurried out of the city before the gates closed, following the main road to Fragrant Mountain Temple. They explained their purpose to the monk and donated a small amount for incense oil. A monk then led them to a room at the back to rest. Lying on the bed, Charles Justice remarked, "The teacher wasn't wrong. If you don't have money, you can stay at a temple. Not only do they provide lodging, but also free tea and meals." The two master and servant lay on the bed chatting. Peter Justice quickly fell into a deep sleep, while Charles Justice closed his eyes, his mind wandering to the images of the two young ladies they had encountered earlier in the day. Particularly, he thought of Miss Williams, whom he had saved. He couldn't help but marvel. How could there be such a beautiful woman in this world? Surely, she must be a celestial being descended to earth. Not long after, he too drifted into sleep. In the middle of the night, he woke up feeling thirsty, and went out to find water. Stepping out of the room, he suddenly saw a dark figure darting across the rooftop. Startled, he thought he might be seeing things and rubbed his eyes. Yet again, he spotted a silhouette standing atop the temple's main hall. The figure lingered there for the time it takes to burn an incense stick, then leapt down. Charles quickly hid himself. The figure began striding toward the back of the mountain. Driven by curiosity, Charles quietly followed. They arrived at a clearing behind the temple, where he saw an old man holding a lantern, accompanied by two other elderly men. Charles hid nearby, using the faint light of the lantern to observe. Among them, he recognized one of the men as the elder Gale, whom he had met earlier that day. Gale removed a sword from his back, handed it to another elder dressed in a long robe, and addressed him as senior brother. "I came across this black iron sword in Chang'an and purchased it. It's no ordinary blade, so I'm gifting it to you. Senior brother, as someone known as Minister Blade, can you discern the origins of this sword?" Minister Blade drew the sword, examined it carefully, and replied, "This is the black iron sword of the Red River Taoist. How did it end up in the marketplace of Chang'an?" Another old man, slightly bald and wearing a conical hat, said, "Brother Tan, you may not know yet, but Shinhao was killed at Old Chang'an Palace. Rumor has it that his death was orchestrated by Tyler Black and Victor Shadow, who joined forces with their allies in the martial world." Minister Blade's face lit up with joy upon hearing this. "That's wonderful news. Do you know where Tyler Black is now?" The slightly bald old man, none other than Grandmaster Lucas Sage, replied, "I received secret intelligence from the Imperial Court. Tyler Black has escaped through Jade Gate Pass and is likely heading toward Tian Shan." Minister Blade, William Blade, nodded. "As long as they're safe. But Grandmaster, what brings you to the capital?" Grandmaster Lucas Sage sat cross-legged and lowered his voice. "Have you ever heard of the Golden Sun Wheel?" Both men were taken aback. Grandmaster Lucas Sage continued, "Legend has it that when a woman rules the world, the Golden Sun Wheel will manifest. My journey here is tied to the Golden Sun Wheel." Philip Gale, puzzled, asked, "Does that mean, Grandmaster, you've already found information about the Golden Sun Wheel?" Grandmaster Lucas Sage replied, "Many have already seen it, and many more will, though they remain unaware of its significance. Philip Gale pressed further. So, Grandmaster, have you seen it yourself? What does the golden sun wheel look like? Shaking his head, Lucas Sage said, The golden sun wheel is an ancient divine artifact. It can only be comprehended, not described. Its appearance will plunge the world into chaos, leaving countless families torn apart and rivers of blood flowing across the land. William Blade remarked, If it's as powerful as you say, wouldn't possessing it allow someone to dominate the world? Grandmaster Lucas Sage responded, Divine artifacts are beyond the control of mere mortals. The two men understood. William Blade then said, Now that Sama Ghost Fortress's master is dead and Victor Shadow's whereabouts are unknown, the fortress has fallen. I no longer know where my path lies. Philip Gale offered, Senior brother, why not return to Manhwa with me? The world is in turmoil, and the martial world is thriving. The Manhwa sect would flourish under your guidance. Grandmaster Lucas Sage interjected, From what I know, Tyler Black has safely arranged for his allies in the martial world, but his younger sister has been imprisoned by Queen Victoria in the Heartbreak Courtyard within the Imperial Palace. William Blade declared, Then we must rescue her. Grandmaster Lucas Sage shook his head. Impossible. If it were feasible, Tyler Black would have acted long ago. Miss Black cannot be saved. Philip Gale, confused, asked, Why not? Grandmaster, do you have any suggestions? Lucas Sage explained, Miss Black has married Prince Lu Ling and even given birth to a daughter. Now she has been brought back to the capital from Fangzhou and imprisoned by Queen Victoria. This serves two purposes, to control the Black siblings and to investigate those conspiring with Prince Lu Ling. William Blade exclaimed, But Miss Black's life is in danger within the palace. We cannot stand idly by. Grandmaster Lucas Sage said, According to my investigation, Miss Black's life is indeed in danger. Queen Victoria could execute her and her mother at any moment. Even if Queen Victoria does not give the order, her nephews will surely act ruthlessly. The two disciples of the Manhwa sect, upon hearing this, immediately grew anxious. They already knew that Rosie Black's life was in peril, but felt powerless to intervene. William Blade said, Are we just supposed to stand by and watch Miss Black and her mother perish? Grandmaster Lucas Sage also spoke gravely. If Tyler Black were here, he would certainly find a way to save Miss Black. However, this matter is extremely dangerous, and under no circumstances can Queen Victoria discover it. Otherwise, Prince Lu Ling will face mortal danger. Charles Justice, eavesdropping from afar, felt his heart tighten with worry, but had no solution to offer. Philip Gale said, Did the Grandmaster not mention that Queen Victoria intends to use Miss Black to control the Black brothers? As long as your disciple and Henry Black do not appear, Miss Black's life should not be in immediate danger. Besides, why would Queen Victoria's nephews care about someone imprisoned? Grandmaster Lucas Sage replied, If the martial world remains calm, Queen Victoria will believe the realm is at peace, and Miss Black will lose her value. Therefore, we must stir up trouble in the capital to make Queen Victoria think the Ghost Fortress is still active, buying time for Miss Black. The two men immediately agreed. Philip Gale asked, Then how should we proceed? Grandmaster Lucas Sage coldly replied, Disguise as the leader of the Ghost Fortress, infiltrate the royal palace, and attempt to assassinate Queen Victoria. Charles Justice, overhearing their plan to assassinate the reigning Queen Victoria, was so shocked that he gasped aloud. He quickly covered his mouth, but William Blade's figure flashed, and in the blink of an eye, he was beside him. Before Charles could react, he felt himself lifted off the ground and, moments later, was thrown down near a lantern. Philip Gale, seeing him, said, So it's you. Could it be that you are a spy sent by the court? William Blade added, If he's a court spy, then let me end his pathetic life and use his blood to consecrate my sword." With that, he drew the black iron sword and thrust it directly toward Charles Justice's chest. Charles Justice, pale with fear, dared not look and quickly closed his eyes. Just as the blade's tip was about to pierce his skin, Grandmaster Lucas Sage intervened, saying, "Don't kill him. Question him first, then decide if he deserves to die." Chapter 4. A Night Encounter with Masters. Danger lurks everywhere, and one must always believe that curiosity can lead to death. Yet most people fail to remain calm and composed. The unknown brings us both intrigue and fear. Charles Justice, caught eavesdropping on the three elders' conversation, narrowly escaped death thanks to Grandmaster Lucas Sage. Hastily, Charles explained, "This humble one is Charles Justice from Handan, Hebei. I am merely lodging here. I got up in the middle of the night to relieve myself and did not intentionally eavesdrop." Philip Gale said, "You look young and don't seem like a court spy. But why are you here? This makes us suspicious." Charles Justice said, "I already told you, but if you don't believe me, there's nothing I can do. However, I know that a chivalrous hero of the martial world would never kill an innocent person without reason." William Blade replied, "That depends on whether you're truly innocent or not." Master Lucas Sage interjected, "For now, we'll spare your life. If you turn out to be a spy for the court, I'm afraid your fate won't end well." Charles Justice exclaimed, "Why do you all hate the court so much? I was planning to join the court as an official." Upon hearing this, William Blade immediately gripped his sword tightly and said, "Then let me send you to the King of Hell to become a high-ranking official." Master Lucas Sage intervened, "Don't trouble him. It's normal for a young man to have aspirations of serving the nation. The problem lies with the corrupt rulers. But surely, you've overheard our discussion just now." Charles Justice was about to deny it when William Blade quickly suggested, "Then let's imprison him for now. Once we've completed our task, we can release him." Charles Justice hastily protested, "You can't do that. Tomorrow morning, I have to attend the court to receive their response." Philip Gale added, "If we leave him be, he might ruin our grand plan. Besides, he submitted a letter of self-recommendation into the four-colored petition box. The court will undoubtedly meet with him." William Blade also said, "If he uses this chance to expose our plan, all our efforts will go to waste. It's better to end this with one swift strike." With that, he raised his dark glinting long sword. Charles Justice quickly pleaded, "No, I swear to the heavens, I won't reveal a single word about your plans. I know you're rescuing someone, and you're not bad people." Master Lucas Sage finally said, "Enough, let him go. We'll reevaluate our strategy." The three people couldn't believe their ears. Master Lucas Sage said, "He is not a bad person, at least not for now. We cannot recklessly kill an innocent person." William Blade reluctantly released him and sheathed his sword. Charles Justice, unable to believe that they would spare him, quickly turned and ran back to his room. Philip Gale, unwilling to accept this, said, "What if this brat breaks his promise and reports us?" Master Lucas Sage replied, "We can observe him secretly. As for rescuing Miss Black, let's put it on hold for now. I'll write a letter to Tyler Black and wait for his reply before deciding further. We must proceed cautiously." The three of them then leaped over the monastery wall and disappeared into the night. As soon as Charles Justice returned to his room, he heard Peter Justice rubbing his sleepy eyes and asking, "Young master, where did you go?" Startled, Charles Justice replied, "It's nothing. I just went to relieve myself. Go back to sleep quickly. We have to wake up early tomorrow." At the break of dawn, hearing the monks and nuns in the monastery rise for their morning prayers, and the scholar in the neighboring room beginning to read, Charles Justice found it inappropriate to continue sleeping. He called Peter Justice to wake up. The two of them got dressed, packed their belongings, left the room, and stepped outside the monastery. Passing by the main hall, they saw over a dozen monks and nuns chanting prayers and performing their morning rituals. At the main gate, a monk sweeping the yard saw them and asked, "Are the benefactors leaving now?" Charles Justice quickly replied, "No, we are just heading into the city to take care of some matters. We will return once we're done." The master and servant followed the official road, heading east toward the city, blending into the early crowd entering divine capital Luoyang. Upon locating the royal palace, they saw a crowd already gathered in front of the bronze pillar at the gate. Seeing that it was still early, with the sky just beginning to brighten, the two found a vacant spot to sit and rest. As the morning progressed, more and more people arrived. Many wore conical hats or covered their faces with cloth, hurriedly placing letters into the bronze pillar before quickly leaving. Suddenly, from a distance, two tall and thin men appeared. The thinner one said, "John Farmer, have you thought this through? Are we really going to accuse landlord Mora?" Charles Justice quickly looked in the direction of the voice. The two men were none other than John Farmer and Tom Shepherd. The two placed their accusation letter into the bronze pillar and turned to leave, only to spot Charles Justice. They stopped in their tracks and stared at him. Charles Justice said, "You have no evidence. The court won't believe you." John Farmer showed disapproval. "Why are you still here? Did you also submit a letter of accusation?" Peter Justice rubbed his sleepy eyes. "My young master is not like you a lot. My young master submitted a self-recommendation letter. He's about to become an official." The two were stunned upon hearing this and said, "Well, good luck to you." With that, they left together with Tom Shepherd. At this moment, a group of officials emerged from the royal palace, and the surrounding crowd hurriedly gathered around. Charles Justice quickly stood up and approached them, only to hear Thomas Fisher announce, "Those who submitted accusations, go back and wait for news." "Is Charles Justice, who submitted a self-recommendation, present?" Charles Justice pushed through the crowd and said, "I'm here. I am Charles Justice." From a distance, an old man wearing a conical hat glanced in his direction, though Charles was unaware of it. Thomas Fisher ordered his attendants to block the crowd and said to Charles Justice, "Kid, you're in luck. Lady Victoria wants Prime Minister George Rock himself to personally test you. Follow me." With that, he turned and headed into the royal palace. Charles Justice hurriedly followed, but the guards at the gate stopped Peter Justice, saying, "You may enter, but your belongings must be left behind." Peter Justice didn't understand what was happening when Thomas Fisher turned back and said, "In the royal palace, unnecessary items are prohibited. Leave them here, it's fine. You can retrieve them when you leave." This was the first time the master and servant duo entered the royal palace. They were dazzled by the grandeur and magnificence of the place. Thomas Fisher led them to a side hall with a sign that read, "Phoenix Pavilion." Although it was just a side hall, it was still much taller than an ordinary house. Thomas Fisher told them to wait at the door while he went inside. Shortly after, he returned and led them into a small room. Inside, for palace lanterns illuminated the space, and a middle-aged man wearing silver official robes was seated on a rosewood chair, reviewing documents. Thomas Fisher quickly stepped forward and said, "Sir Gentle, this is Charles Justice, who self-recommended himself, along with his assistant Peter Justice." Charles Justice hurriedly clasped his hands in salute. William Gentle asked, "Are you Charles Justice? How old are you this year?" Charles Justice promptly replied, "This humble one is 17 this year." Although he spoke softly, sweat was already forming on his forehead. Peter Justice also held his breath, as they had no idea that the man before them was Grand Chancellor William Gentle of the Great Tang, who had taken over the position after Willow's execution. William Gentle said, "In your self-recommendation letter, you claim to have mastered the 4 books and 5 classics. However, I want to test your administrative abilities. Tell me, how would you ensure that farmers across the land can live in peace and prosperity?" Upon hearing this, Charles Justice's mind went blank. He had never anticipated such a question in this examination and didn't know how to respond. William Gentle waited for a moment. Seeing the young man unable to answer, he said, "Perhaps this question is too difficult. Then compose a poem. Any poem will do, as long as it's your own creation." With that, he waved his hand, signaling a palace maid to bring a writing set. A graceful and charming palace maid approached, carrying a wooden tray. Her beauty was captivating, and she cast a curious glance at Charles Justice. Lowering his head, Charles Justice noticed that the young woman's attire had a deep neckline, causing him to blush. After pondering for a moment, he finally picked up the brush and wrote on the paper, "Victoria seeks virtuous talents. Citizens rush to recommend. This humble one lacks skill, awaiting the Chancellor's judgment. The 4-colored petition box placed before the palace, embracing the nation's talents. With a heart set on serving the country, I humbly present this plea in blood. Write, put the pen to paper." He exhaled softly. Though unsure of his own talent, after 10 years of diligent study, composing a poem was still within his ability. The palace maid received the letter and cast him a look of admiration. Charles Justice quickly lowered his head, having just raised it moments before. William Gentle took the poem, read it, and smiled while shaking his head. "Young man, though you have the determination to serve the court, you lack the capability to ease its burdens. I advise you to study for a few more years and then participate in the imperial examinations." Hearing this, Charles Justice felt somewhat disheartened and said, "In my hometown, there are no books to read, nor teachers to instruct me. That is why I've come to the capital." William Gentle replied, "If that is the case, you may stay in the capital and study at the Imperial Academy. The scholars there are erudite, and you are someone who can be nurtured. Once you've gained sufficient knowledge, you can take the imperial examinations or even recommend yourself again." With that, he instructed the palace maid, "Lead them outside." Charles Justice blushed and said, "But I've only just arrived in the capital, a stranger in a foreign place. I don't even know where the Imperial Academy is." William Gentle responded, "Oh, in that case, take my calling card there. They will naturally welcome and arrange for you to study." Thomas Fisher handed over the calling card and said to him, "Hurry and thank the Prime Minister. Lord Gentle doesn't easily give out his calling card." Charles Justice, along with Peter Justice, quickly expressed their gratitude to the Prime Minister before following the palace made out of the royal palace. In the Phoenix Pavilion, Thomas Fisher asked curiously, "Prime Minister, this young man knows how to compose poetry. Why not give him a small official position?" William Gentle took a sip of tea and replied, "Knowing poetry doesn't necessarily mean knowing how to govern. He is still young and needs more learning." Charles Justice and Peter Justice followed the palace maid, their hearts pounding. The young woman turned back and said, "I didn't expect someone so young to already know how to compose poetry." Her voice was sweet and pleasant. Charles Justice quickly replied, "You flatter me, miss. May I ask for your name?" The maid softly said, "This is not something you should ask. If Lord Supervisor finds out, I will be in trouble." After speaking, she led the two to the gates of the Imperial Palace. Charles Justice then said, "But I still don't know how to get to the Imperial Academy." The young lady turned back and said, "You can ask someone, can't you?" The master and servant left the Imperial Palace, and immediately people surrounded them, asking how it went. Charles Justice waved his hand, pushed through the crowd, and followed the street in front of the palace. They hadn't gone far when a familiar yet stern voice rang in his ears. "It seems the court doesn't want you to become an official." Hearing this, Charles Justice quickly looked in the direction of the voice, only to see a person wearing a conical hat standing before him, back turned to him. Peter Justice couldn't help but ask suspiciously, "Who are you? How do you know my master was rejected?" The person in the conical hat let out a cold laugh and said, "Though I didn't follow you into the palace, I could clearly see your every move. This must be the first time you've met a palace maid, right?" Charles Justice asked doubtfully, "What palace maid? I swear I would never disclose your secrets." Peter Justice, equally perplexed, asked, "What secrets?" As soon as the words were spoken, his head was lightly tapped again, and the owner said, "You're still young. Don't ask too many questions." The person wearing the conical hat continued walking forward, leaving behind a remark, "I will secretly monitor you." Charles Justice was inwardly astonished, while Peter Justice scratched his head and asked, "Young master, where should we go now?" He looked at the bustling traffic on the street, his stomach growling with hunger. Charles Justice was also a bit confused. Taking out the business card of the Prime Minister, he said, "Let's go to the Imperial Academy." The two then asked for directions along the way and learned that the Imperial Academy was located to the north of West Market Street. They soon saw a stone stele engraved with the words, "Imperial Academy." Heading north, there was a large gate with many scholars entering. Overjoyed, the two quickly followed, only to be stopped by a young man in white, seemingly around 20 years old. This man wore a silk white outfit, a golden belt, and a jade pendant. He stared at them with narrow eyes and loudly asked, "Who are you? Do you even know where this is, daring to barge in like that?" Charles Justice quickly turned toward the voice, and saw that the young man had a pale face, as if powdered, wore a white headscarf, and was slightly taller than him. He hastily said, "Excuse me, sir, is this the Imperial Academy?" The young man replied, "So you can't read? What a waste of a scholar's outfit. Get out of here. This is not a place for you." Charles Justice hurriedly responded, "We've come here specifically. Where is the teacher? We wish to meet him." The young man grabbed him by the collar and pushed him outside, saying, "Not only can't you read, but you don't even understand human speech? I told you to leave." At that moment, a youthful voice rang out loudly, "Stop right there." Chapter 5, the 5th episode, Students of the Imperial Academy. In divine capital Luoyang, at the Imperial Academy, Charles Justice was being blocked at the gate. A tall, well-dressed young scholar was about to push him out when another young man, of average build and also dressed elegantly, approached and intervened, saying, "You must not bully others." The scholar in white, seeing who it was, released his grip and stepped back, saying, "Brother Young, how do you know this little fellow?" The scholar named Young replied, "I don't know him, but judging by his attire, this brother also looks like a scholar. Brother, have you come to the Imperial Academy to pursue your studies?" Charles Justice quickly straightened up and said, "I am Charles Justice, recommended by Prime Minister Cat himself, coming specifically to study at the Imperial Academy." Peter Justice muttered, "Why are you all so rude, not even asking anything before pushing us out?" The scholar named Young said, "Oh, so you were recommended by Prime Minister Cat. I am Victor Grace, and this is John Justice. Do you have a letter of recommendation?" Charles Justice was momentarily stunned and hurriedly took out the Prime Minister's business card, handing it over as he said, "Would this suffice?" Upon seeing the card, John Justice couldn't help but be astonished. Victor Grace took the card, glanced at it, and said, "Come with me to meet Director Wing of the Imperial Academy." Turning around, he added to John Justice, "Junior Danielson, in the future, do not judge others by their appearances." The two master and servant quickly followed him into the main hall, and then exited through a side door leading to the rear courtyard. Peter Justice, puzzled, asked, "What does the director of the Imperial Academy do?" Victor Grace explained, "The director is an official specifically in charge of the Imperial Academy. This academy is overseen by individuals appointed by the court, and the students here are selected from scholars across the land, only the most outstanding ones." Hearing that the students here were all exceptional talents chosen from across the country, Charles Justice couldn't help but feel a surge of pride, thinking he must also be among the elite. He secretly rejoiced in his heart. Reaching the rear courtyard, they saw a group of scholars loudly reciting texts. Along the walls surrounding the courtyard were various weapons and archery targets. Peter Justice couldn't help but feel curious, but before he could ask, an elderly man in his 50s, dressed in green robes, with a goatee and graying temples, yet sharp eyes, appeared. Victor Grace quickly addressed him. "This is Charles Justice, presenting the business card of Lord Cat to pay his respects." With that, he handed over the card. The elderly man examined it and remarked, "Lord Cat personally recommended this individual. I wonder what makes him special." He then turned to look at Charles Justice. The two master and servant quickly clasped their hands in salute. The elderly man nodded and said, "You seem young. Let me test you a bit." Charles Justice thought to himself, "Why must there be another test?" But he still replied, "Please, sir, present your question." The elderly man asked, "Between Taoism and Buddhism, which is more suitable for governing people's hearts?" Hearing this, Charles Justice felt his mind buzzing and replied, "Sir, this was never taught in private school. I do not know." Victor Grace couldn't help but chuckle quietly upon hearing this, feeling even more anxious inside. The old man said, "All right, I see that your physique suggests you practice martial arts. Can you ride a horse, shoot arrows, and lift weights?" During the Tang Dynasty, families from the Qianlong group emphasized both literary and martial training for their children, especially those from the 5 prominent clans. Although Charles Justice was from Hebei, his father was influenced by this tradition. In addition to sending his son to private schools for academic learning, he also hired martial arts instructors for him. Seeing Charles Justice remain silent, the old man continued, "The Imperial Academy nurtures the pillars of the nation. Its requirements are that one must be skilled enough to ride into battle and literate enough to wield a pen with grace. If I didn't know your background, I might not have been able to retain you here." Charles Justice quickly replied, "I can compose poetry and have trained in martial arts. It's just that you asked so suddenly, I wasn't prepared to respond." The old man said, "Oh, then I'll select someone to compete with you. If you can surpass them, you may stay." Charles Justice eagerly agreed. At this moment, John Justice stepped forward, clasped his hands, and respectfully said, "Student greets the director of the academy and requests permission to compete with my fellow student." George Ceremony nodded and replied, "This is merely a friendly match. Do not harm each other." Both nodded in agreement, clasped their hands to salute one another, and began. Nearby students, while continuing their studies, turned their heads slightly to watch the duel. John Justice casually picked up a bow, nocked an arrow, aimed at the bullseye, and released. The arrow struck the red center, earning praise from Victor Grace. Peter Justice whispered, "Young master, it seems you've never used a bow before." Unwilling to concede, Charles Justice grabbed the bow and said, "Have you forgotten how we often went hunting in the mountains? My archery isn't bad either." He drew the bow, nocked an arrow, and released, but the arrow missed the target entirely, striking the stand below. His face flushed with embarrassment. George Ceremony shook his head and walked towards the bullseye. The students immediately erupted in murmurs. Charles Justice said, "Let's compete in something else, like hand-to-hand combat. John Justice eagerly rolled up his sleeves and said with a grin, "I was waiting for you to say that." As he spoke, he reached out to grab Charles Justice's shoulders. Charles Justice quickly sidestepped, avoiding the grasp. He countered with a double palm strike, hitting John Justice squarely in the chest. John Justice stepped back, exhaled, and suddenly launched a right palm strike aimed at Charles Justice's right abdomen. Charles Justice once again dodged swiftly, intercepting his opponent's palm strike and locking their internal energies in a contest of strength. When Charles Justice felt his internal energy faltering, John Justice suddenly withdrew his hand and followed up with a left palm strike, landing 3 rapid punches on Charles Justice's abdomen. Charles managed to evade one, but was struck by 2, causing him to grit his teeth in pain. At this moment, George Ceremony interjected, "That's enough. Charles Justice, you may stay. Now, write an essay about what you've seen and heard in Luoyang and submit it to me tonight." Charles Justice quickly steadied himself as John Justice said, "Kid, you're quite something." After speaking, he stepped back. Victor Grace approached and asked, "Are you seriously injured?" Charles Justice regulated his breathing and replied, "It's nothing. I can handle it." Victor Grace commented, "The 3 punches from young Master Danielson. His first punch is a feint, while the next 2 are real strikes. The fact that you withstood 2 of them without collapsing or spitting blood is already impressive." Peter Justice helped Charles Justice sit down beside him. Charles asked, "Who is this person? How is he so formidable?" Victor Grace explained, "He is the great-grandson of General Luke Danielson." Victor Grace then added, "Do the 2 of you have any other belongings? Bring them here, and I'll arrange accommodations. Classes will begin tomorrow." With that, he led them to the dormitory. By this time, the students who had been studying had dispersed. One student followed them to the dormitory and remarked, "Wow, such luxury! Even bringing a servant to school." Charles Justice blushed and said, "Is it not allowed? If so, I'll send him home." Victor Grace interjected, "There's no need. You're far from home, so having someone to look after you is a good thing." He then turned to the student and said, "Barksteel, I see you're kind-hearted and don't bully newcomers. That's why I've arranged for Charles Justice to share a room with you. From now on, you'll be classmates, help each other, and make progress together." Both nodded in agreement. Victor Grace left, and Charles Justice quickly said, "Senior Brother Steele, I'll be counting on your guidance from now on." Mark Steele replied, "This dormitory is a bit small, with only 2 beds. However, you can add a smaller bed. If there's anything you don't understand, feel free to ask me." At noon, Mark Steele guided the 2 to have a meal. John Justice said, "Young brother, eat as much as you'd like. Meals here are free, so no need to hold back." After finishing their meal, they returned to the dormitory. Charles Justice said, "I still need to make a trip to Fragrant Mountain Temple outside the capital. I promise to return before nightfall." Mark Steele was lying on the bed reading a book and said, "I am not your teacher, so you don't need to report everything to me. Your classes start tomorrow. If you don't know the way, I can guide you." Charles Justice quickly replied, "No need, I know the way." After saying this, he led Peter Justice together out of the Imperial Academy and headed to Fragrant Mountain Temple. When the 2 returned to the room they stayed in yesterday, they were startled to see Philip Gale sitting on the bed inside. Peter Justice asked, "Who are you? Why are you here?" Philip Gale stood up and said, "Now that you've entered the Imperial Academy, focus on your studies. Treat what happened last night as a dream. If you can't forget it quickly, nightmares will haunt you." After finishing his words, he left the room. Charles Justice hurriedly said, "Senior, please wait." Philip Gale stopped at the door, turned back and said, Can't you forget it? Charles Justice replied. No, I want to take you as my master and learn martial arts. Philip Gale strode out, saying, Your aptitude is too poor. I already have many disciples. You'd better find another master. Hearing this, Charles Justice sat down on the bed, dejected. Peter Justice, confused, asked, Who was that? Why do you suddenly want to learn martial arts? Charles Justice said, You don't need to know. Curiosity can be dangerous. The two rested for a while, packed their belongings, and then bid farewell to the monks in the temple. The other scholars staying there looked at them curiously. Peter Justice proudly said, My master has been admitted to the Imperial Academy. Before dinner, the two returned to the Imperial Academy. John Justice was heading out and, seeing them, said, You two have perfect timing. You must have guessed dinner is about to start. Charles Justice respectfully bowed without replying and returned to the dormitory. Mark Steele said, You're just in time. Let's go have dinner together. While dining among the crowd, he didn't see Victor Grace and asked, Why isn't Senior Victor here? Mark Steele replied, His family lives right here in divine capital Luoyang, so he doesn't have dinner at the academy. Do you know who Victor Grace's father is? Charles Justice shook his head, indicating he didn't know. Mark Steele paused his meal and whispered, He is Doi Hongzhu from the prestigious Wadong family. His sister is married to the grandson of Victoria Queen, Victor Queen. Charles Justice also didn't know who Victor Queen was, but upon hearing that he was Victoria's nephew, he was quite surprised. After dinner, Mark Steele led him to the martial arts training ground, where the students were practicing archery or swordsmanship. Mark Steele walked to the target and said, You managed to shoot the arrow into the base of the stand. Impressive. Charles Justice blushed again. Early the next morning, after finishing breakfast, Charles Justice officially began his studies. The instructor was a Confucian scholar named Li, who was elderly with white hair, and he lectured in the Guangzhou dialect about Mencius philosophy. The teacher explained, Learning must go hand in hand with practice. Relying solely on books will not enable you to govern the people. After your studies, you must pass the imperial examination to become an official. Charles Justice immediately asked, Isn't it true that as long as one has talent, they can use the four-colored petition box in front of the imperial palace to recommend themselves, bypassing the need for the examination to become an official? The students murmured among themselves upon hearing this, but Teacher Li was not angry. He replied, You've recommended yourself, but has the court appointed you as an official yet? Charles Justice blushed again. Teacher Li continued, The four-colored petition box is for exceptional individuals. You still need to pass the imperial examination to prove your abilities. At the Imperial Academy, students studied for 10 days, and then had 1 day off. Charles Justice had only been studying for 5 days, when the first rest day arrived. He decided to explore the city, but was afraid of getting lost, so he invited Mark Steele to accompany him. Mark Steele cheerfully agreed, saying, Do you have money? Treat me to some wine later. Charles Justice asked, Does the teacher allow drinking? Mark Steele replied, Drinking a little is fine. Otherwise, how will you compose poetry? The three wandered aimlessly through the streets. Peter Justice found everything fascinating, while Charles Justice scanned the crowd. Mark Steele noticed and asked, Are you looking for someone? Charles Justice quickly denied it, saying, No, I just find it interesting that Luoyang has so many unusual people, like those with blue eyes and blonde hair. Mark Steele said, Those are foreigners. The world is vast, and the Tang dynasty is not the only nation. However, no other country has territory as vast as ours. Charles Justice nodded in agreement. Unintentionally, he began walking toward Clear Peace District on East Grand Avenue. Mark Steele asked, Do you have a specific place in mind to visit? Charles Justice quickly replied. I heard Clearpiece District is nice. Why don't we go there? Mark Steele, upon hearing this, was immediately astonished and said, You know what kind of place that is, yet you still want to go there. Peter Justice, upon hearing this, asked, What kind of place is it? It seems like it's Miss Williams' residence. Mark Steele replied, Clearpiece District is the estate of Master Arthur Queen. Could it be that you know Master Wu? Charles Justice quickly shook his head and said, I was just speaking randomly. We'll just stand outside and have a look. We won't go in. Mark Steele said, That's fine, but don't stay there for too long. Charles Justice quickly agreed, while Peter Justice teased, Young master, are you missing Miss Williams already? As Mark Steele led the way, he curiously asked, Which Miss Williams are you talking about? Is she a friend of yours? Charles Justice quickly shook his head and said, Don't listen to his nonsense. I just want to familiarize myself with the capital quickly. Outside Clearpiece District, there were indeed 2 soldiers holding spears, standing guard. From a distance, the 3 of them saw a young lady walking out of a large gate nearby. Charles Justice was overjoyed. The young lady was none other than Miss Williams. At that moment, a middle-aged man dressed in luxurious attire also walked out of the main gate. He said, Sarah, don't be too ostentatious. Miss Williams replied, Father, what's there to be afraid of? Everyone knows the court highly values you. Who would dare to bully your precious daughter? The father and daughter got into a carriage and headed in their direction. Charles Justice quickly lowered his head. Unexpectedly, when the carriage reached them, the curtain was lifted, and Miss Williams said, Were you waiting for me here? Chapter 6. The 6th episode. The gentleman is captured. The pain of unrequited love lies in longing to meet the one you love, yet fearing being near them when you finally do. Charles Justice didn't expect Miss Williams to notice him. While he was still surprised, the father and daughter stepped out of the carriage. Miss Williams said, Father, this is the young man who saved me. Mr. Williams looked at him and said, Thank you, young man, for your assistance. May I know where you learned your skills? Charles Justice quickly replied, It was an act of goodwill, not worth mentioning. I am currently studying at the Imperial Academy. Mark Steele listened and said, I never expected Junior Justice to be a hero rescuing a damsel in distress. Charles Justice blushed and replied, It was just a small act of compassion, nothing worth mentioning. Miss Williams asked, Do you also study at Imperial Academy? Then, do you know Victor Grace? Charles Justice quickly replied, Senior Victor? Of course, he was the one who guided me into Imperial Academy. Mr. Williams said, Imperial Academy is full of outstanding scholars. That Victor is actually the fiancé of my daughter. Hearing this, Charles Justice felt a chill in his heart, but his expression remained unchanged as he responded, That's wonderful. Senior Victor is a great person. Mr. Williams said to him, You are also a fine young man. Study hard, and your future will be limitless. If you don't yet have a betrothal, I could help find you a fine match. Charles Justice quickly replied, I'm still young and not in a rush. Mr. Williams smiled, Well, then now you know where we live. If you ever need anything, feel free to come find me, and I will do my best to assist you. Charles Justice hurriedly expressed his gratitude. Miss Williams asked, Don't you all have leisure time? Why is Victor always so busy? I wonder what he's occupied with. Mark Steele replied, Senior Victor is preparing for this year's Imperial examination, so he's busy studying. The father and daughter understood, and then took their leave, boarding their carriage and departing. Charles Justice felt a bitter taste in his mouth, a deep and indescribable disappointment rising within him. Mark Steele noticed this and said, Miss Williams comes from a prestigious family in the capital. A beautiful flower is bound to have its owner. Don't dwell on it. Charles Justice had no choice but to let it go. Victor Grace was truly exceptional, someone he could never hope to compare to. On the second day off, he took Peter Justice to Fragrant Mountain Temple again. This time, they didn't meet Philip Gale, leaving him feeling empty. Peter Justice asked, "Young master, what's wrong? You don't seem happy." Charles Justice replied, "No matter how hard I try, I fear I'll never surpass those senior students. My martial arts skills are also lacking. I just want to find a true master to teach me martial arts." Peter Justice said, "The old man we met at Fragrant Mountain Temple, isn't he a master?" Charles Justice nodded and replied, "But I don't know where he is. Even if I did, there's no guarantee he'd accept me as a disciple." Peter Justice said, "There isn't only one master in this world. You could look for another one, couldn't you?" Charles Justice asked, "Another master? Where would I find one?" Peter Justice thought for a moment and said, "I know where we might find one. Isn't there a self-recommendation box at the palace gates? Let's go there and take a look. Maybe we'll come across a master recommending themselves." Charles Justice responded, "That's true. Although the chances are slim, it's our only option." The two master and servant promptly returned to the capital and went to the palace gates. There, they saw a prison cart escorted by imperial guards coming out of the palace. A minor official loudly announced, "This is Thomas Fisher, the one who designed the four-colored petition box and incited the people to accuse the court. He's the son of Gregory Fisher, the former censor. Now, he himself has been accused." Charles Justice quickly looked into the prison cart and saw Thomas Fisher wearing a prisoner's uniform, his hair disheveled, and his face full of despair. He couldn't help but feel puzzled and called out, "Lord Fisher." As soon as he spoke, someone covered his mouth. The person coldly said, "He's no longer Lord Fisher. He's a criminal about to be executed." Charles Justice struggled free and turned around to look. Behind him stood a middle-aged man in silk robes. The man had a thick, long black beard reaching his chest and kind eyes. He softly said, "The world is unpredictable, truly." Charles Justice quickly asked, "Sir, do we know each other?" The middle-aged man replied, "You were the first young man to drop a self-recommendation letter into the four-colored petition box. I met you in the royal palace. How are things at the Imperial Academy?" Hearing that the man recognized him, Charles Justice hurriedly clasped his hands in respect and said, "This student greets you, sir. May I know your esteemed name?" The middle-aged man said, "This isn't the place to talk. There's a tea house nearby. Let me treat you to a cup of tea." Charles Justice quickly said, "It should be me inviting you for tea, sir. Please have a seat." The two went to a small nearby tea house, a place bustling with idle chatter. The middle-aged man found a spot near the corner and sat down, ordering a pot of Malicious tea. 3 cups were poured, and the fragrance of tea immediately filled the air. The middle-aged man spoke, "I am Destiny Lee, a Sherlang of Phoenix Pavilion. That day at Phoenix Pavilion, when Chancellor Rock tested you, I thought his question was far too profound for someone your age to answer. However, your poem was commendable. If you work harder at the Imperial Academy, you will surely become a pillar of the nation." Charles Justice replied, "Thank you for your praise, Sir Lee, but I feel that there are too many outstanding individuals at the Imperial Academy. No matter how hard I try, I cannot surpass them. I'm considering switching to martial arts." Destiny Lee, upon hearing this, raised an eyebrow and said, "Literature and martial arts are 2 entirely different paths. At the Imperial Academy, Charles Scholar, who once taught the former Crown Prince Cody Lee, is a learned and versatile teacher, truly one of a kind. As for martial arts, you would need a master willing to take you in. Do you have such a mentor?" Charles Justice shook his head. Destiny Lee advised, Then, in my opinion, you should focus on your studies. Nowadays, with the emergence of the four-colored petition box, people are living in fear. Years ago, Thomas Fisher designed the four-colored petition box, only to later be accused of forging weapons for the rebel Charles Justice. The matter has since been thoroughly investigated, and Victoria has ordered his public execution. Charles Justice said, "But I don't think Lord Fisher seemed like a bad person." Destiny Lee chuckled. "Ah, you are still too young. The world is not simply divided into good and bad people. Studying is far more stable than learning martial arts." The two continued their conversation for a while longer before Destiny Lee took his leave. Charles Justice returned to the Imperial Academy and discreetly inquired about Crown Prince Cody Lee from Sir Lee. Upon hearing the question, Sir Lee's face immediately turned pale as he said, "That is all in the past. Don't bring it up again. This May, there will be an Imperial examination. If you pass, you can leave the Imperial Academy and take up an official post." Charles Justice responded, "But I still feel uneasy in my heart." Sir Lee said, "Then you must work even harder. I will teach you everything you need to know for the examination." Charles Justice eagerly listened. Sir Lee explained, "The Imperial examination today is no longer just about book knowledge. That is merely the foundation. Examiners now place greater emphasis on practical ability. You must think critically and apply what you've learned from books to real-life situations. That is true skill." He then elaborated on many aspects of the examination. Charles Justice listened attentively, though his anxiety about failing only grew. The next day, while Sir Lee was teaching his students, a group of officers burst into the room. They carried a sealed letter in chains, stepping forward to announce, "You have been accused of being the former teacher of Crown Prince Cody Lee and of inciting him to rebellion. By the order of Administrator Shing of Gale Prefecture, we are here to arrest you for trial." Sir Lee was stunned upon hearing this. Victor Gray stepped forward and demanded, "Do you have evidence to support your claim that Sir Lee incited the Crown Prince to rebellion?" A government official sneered coldly, "No evidence. We'll interrogate him, and evidence will naturally surface." With that, he ordered his subordinates to arrest the man. Victor Grace immediately stepped in front of Mr. Lee and said, "You have no evidence to arrest someone and coerce a confession. This goes against the laws of the Great Tang." The official retorted, "Oh, so you understand the laws of the Great Tang? Well, today, I am determined to arrest him. Let's see if you can stop me." He rolled up his sleeves, preparing to seize the man. Mark Steele and John Justice quickly stepped forward to shield Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee calmly said, "There's no need for this. I am innocent. Victoria knows this." The official smirked. "I am acting under Victoria's secret orders to arrest you. It seems your students are plotting rebellion. How dare you defy Victoria?" Victor Grace, angered by the baseless accusation, retorted, "Don't falsely accuse us. If these are Victoria's secret orders, then show them to us. Otherwise, you're unlawfully arresting people." The junior official, named Mark Smith, had previously worked as a bailiff at the Luoyang Prefecture office. After gaining favor by reporting his superior's misconduct, he was promoted by Victoria to the rank of Vanguard General, tasked with carrying out arrests, a role that perfectly matched his former occupation. His competence earned him the trust of his superior, Zhou Xing, who had narrowly escaped being burned alive at Jade Gate Pass thanks to Aaron Black's heroic rescue, owed his survival to this act of bravery. Robert Rising reported the situation at Jade Gate Pass to Victoria, shifting all blame onto Wei Yuanzhong and Arthur Wing to avoid accountability. Now, both he and Arthur Wing had been summoned back to the capital. Robert was promoted to handle accusations submitted via copper tubes, while Arthur Wing was placed under house arrest. Upon receiving a report accusing Charles Scholar of the Imperial Academy, who had once taught Crown Prince Cody Lee, of inciting rebellion, Victoria dispatched Mark Smith to arrest him. Mark Smith assumed capturing a scholar would be as easy as apprehending minor officials, only to find himself blocked by the Imperial Academy's students. Enraged, he swung an iron chain toward Victor Grace. As a former bailiff, Mark Smith often used chains as whips and had developed some skill with them over time, intending to intimidate the students. Victor Grace dodged the attack, grabbed the chain, and countered. "What's this? Can't produce Victoria's secret orders, so now you resort to violence?" Mark Smith, momentarily stunned, shouted, "Victoria's secret orders are not for your eyes." After saying that, he forcefully pulled the iron chain but felt that the opponent's strength was immense, making it impossible to pull away. His heart faltered. At this moment, George Ceremony, the superintendent of the academy, rushed over upon hearing the commotion and hurriedly intervened, asking what had happened. Mark Smith, having been untied, quickly took out the arrest warrant signed by Robert Rising, presented it to him, and said, "I am acting under the orders of Lord Rising to apprehend the suspect, but these students are obstructing me." Seeing George Ceremony dressed in green official robes, he realized that this person held a significant position in the court, so he dared not act recklessly anymore. George Ceremony suspiciously asked, "May I know what crime Mr. Lee has committed that warrants his arrest?" Mark Smith replied, "According to Lord Rising, someone accused him of inciting Prince Cody Lee to rebel while serving as the prince's tutor." Charles Scholar immediately defended himself. "I only taught the prince for a short time when he visited the Luoyang kingdom. The rebellion of the prince is a wrongful charge. How could I possibly incite him to treason?" George Ceremony waved his hand, signaling him not to defend further, and said, "Officer, who exactly made this accusation? Is there any evidence? If not, this is slander." Mark Smith said, "I am merely following orders. The rest I do not know. Whether Mr. Lee is innocent or not will be determined after Lord Rising interrogates him." Victor Grace interjected, "Everyone knows you people use torture on prisoners. If there is to be an interrogation, it should be conducted at the Supreme Judicial Court." Charles Scholar stopped him and said, "I firmly believe, whether clear or murky, I am innocent and have no fear of their interrogation." Seeing that he could not intervene, George Ceremony said, "Mr. Lee, rest assured, I will enter the palace to seek an audience with Victoria to prove your innocence. You must remain steadfast." Mark Smith pushed Victor Grace aside, locked the iron chain onto Charles Scholar, and ordered his subordinates to leave. Watching them arrogantly walk away, Charles Justice and his fellow students clenched their fists, their eyes burning with fury, but they were powerless to stop them, their hearts filled with even more resentment. He recalled Mr. Lee's teachings from the previous night, feeling only hatred for his own incompetence in being unable to save his teacher. George Ceremony turned to the students and said, "Continue your self-studies. I will go to the palace to seek an audience with Victoria." Victor Grace immediately said, "Sir, I will go with you." Other students eagerly chimed in, "We will accompany you to seek an audience with Victoria." George Ceremony quickly said, "Although you are students of the Imperial Academy, and some of you even hail from noble families, you currently hold no official positions. You cannot enter the palace at will. I will go alone." Charles Justice mustered up his courage and said, "I have the business card of the current Prime Minister. I can take it and accompany you. I humbly ask for your permission, Dean." George Ceremony replied, "This is a serious matter. If it fails, it could affect your future career in government service." Charles Justice said, "I am not afraid. After all, I do not desire a government position. Moreover, I can plead with the Prime Minister for assistance." Hearing this, George Ceremony was overjoyed and said, "It seems you have come to understand the principles of governance. Very well, come with me. Chapter 7. The seventh episode. Key ministers of the court. Only by letting go can one truly gain. When you let go, your hands are free to grasp even more. Charles Justice decided to accompany George Ceremony to the palace. However, being an insignificant figure, he naturally couldn't meet Victoria directly. Hence, he planned to meet Prime Minister William Gentle, hoping the Prime Minister could assist the Dean in arranging an audience with Victoria. Peter Justice, seeing this and knowing the journey might be dangerous, quickly said, "I want to go with you." George Ceremony firmly replied, "No, I am already old, so I'll risk myself to submit the petition to Victoria. Charles Justice is going to persuade the Prime Minister. The others should stay at the Imperial Academy and refrain from acting recklessly." The group had no choice but to agree. George Ceremony led Charles Justice out of the Imperial Academy. To save time, they hired a carriage to head to the royal palace. Upon arrival at the palace gates, they saw a crowd of commoners gathered around the bronze petition rails. The dean softly remarked, "This thing only brings harm to people." At the palace gates, the two presented their official name cards to the guards before entering. They first headed to the Phoenix Pavilion. The Phoenix Pavilion was the place Victoria had designated for the Prime Minister and the 6 ministry officials to work. Usually, after court sessions ended, the officials would handle their duties here. The court session had long ended, and the officials were busy inside. When the two entered, Don Lee, a clerk at the Phoenix Pavilion, greeted them. "Dean, what brings you here?" George Ceremony quickly recounted the incident involving Charles Scholar's arrest. Charles Justice hurried off to find the Prime Minister but, unexpectedly, encountered Destiny Lee instead. Surprised by his presence, the two found a quiet corner to talk. Upon learning about Charles Scholar's arrest, a minor official nearby stopped what he was doing and angrily exclaimed, "The bronze petition rails have become a tool for villains to falsely accuse others. Instead of recruiting talents, it has invited a bunch of scoundrels who betray others." Hearing this, Charles Justice looked toward the man. Destiny Lee quickly introduced him. "This is the great poet Edward Balance. Have you read his poem Climbing the Tower of Ujo?" Upon hearing that the man in ordinary official attire was none other than the great poet Edward Balance, Charles Justice was astonished. He quickly said, "Yes, I've read it. Sir, your poem says, 'I see no ancients before me, nor any to come after. Reflecting on the vastness of heaven and earth, I am moved to tears.' The opening lines of the poem are truly majestic. Ujo is not far from my hometown of Handan. I once visited there, and reading your poem immediately made me feel humbled." Edward Balance replied, "I heard you were the first to submit a recommendation letter into the bronze petition rails. That's quite bold." Charles Justice blushed and said, "I only did it to make a living. Moreover, my talents are meager, so I couldn't pass the Prime Minister's examination." Edward Balance said, "You are still young, don't lose heart. I also only began focusing on reading at your age. This bronze petition rails was originally a good intention, but the court's handling of it has given petty people a chance to exploit it." Destiny Lee quickly signaled for him to lower his voice to avoid being overheard. Edward Balance also lowered his voice and said, "These days, while proofreading legal documents at the Secretariat, I've discovered many wrongful cases caused by accusations. Some cases lack evidence, yet confessions were coerced. It is said that Victoria has been employing certain individuals to secretly arrest people, and even the prisons can't hold them all. This is why there is a petition for Victoria to establish a prison at the Council of Rectitude." Destiny Lee sighed and said, "I wonder what the ministers think of this." At this moment, William Gentle stepped out from the inner chamber. George Ceremony quickly stepped forward to pay his respects and reported on the situation at the Imperial Academy. After the ministers deliberated, they decided to request an audience with Victoria to plead for Charles Scholar's pardon. Charles Justice also wanted to join, but George Ceremony said, "You don't hold an official position. Stay here and wait for my news." William Gentle led the group to the welcoming Immortal's courtyard where Victoria resided. Outside the Immortal City Palace, they were stopped by two female officials, who informed them that Victoria was meeting with Arthur Queen and Robert Rising. Hearing this, George Ceremony grew secretly anxious. Inside the Immortal City Palace, Victoria Queen was reclining on a soft bed, enjoying a massage from the great monk Benedict Monk, formerly known as Hennessy, now the abbot of White Horse Temple, but who served Victoria Queen daily in the palace. Robert Rising reported, "I was ordered to go to Yu Prefecture to capture the 5 tigers of Luoyang, but Henry Black led his troops to block me. He even hid the 5 tigers, and I dared not engage in conflict with him, so I returned to seek Victoria's instructions." Arthur Queen added, "Although Henry Black was demoted to Yu Prefecture, he still holds military power. In my opinion, his command should be revoked." Victoria Queen said, "According to Robert Rising, the 5 tigers of Luoyang and other bandits from the old palace in Chang'an have joined forces to kill the Red Summer Taoist. However, there is no evidence or witnesses. If this is true, then the 5 tigers are indeed guilty of heinous crimes." Robert Rising quickly said, "If Victoria issues the order, I will capture the 5 tigers for interrogation and provide an answer." Victoria Queen said, "Very well. Sophia, draft an edict for me. If Henry Black dares to interfere again, have him arrested as well." Sophia Grace, standing by her side, quickly complied, picked up a brush, and drafted the edict. She then presented it to Victoria Queen, who, after reviewing it, was very pleased and instructed Benedict Monk to affix the imperial seal. Robert Rising eagerly accepted the imperial decree and left joyfully with Arthur Queen. At the palace gates, they encountered William Gentle and the others. Surprised, they quickly noticed George Ceremony and immediately understood what was going on. The palace maid Manhwa reported that the ministers were requesting an audience with Victoria. Victoria Queen said, "What matter requires them to seek an audience together? Summon them." William Gentle led the group into the Immortal City Palace to meet Victoria. George Rock immediately brought up the matter of Charles Scholar at the Imperial Academy. Queen Victoria, after hearing this, said, "So, this is about such a minor issue. Robert Rising was merely acting based on the accusation letter when he arrested the person. If Charles Scholar claims he is innocent, then why fear interrogation?" George Ceremony quickly responded, "It is said that Lord Rising uses torture on prisoners. I fear that Sir Lee, being advanced in age, might not withstand such harsh treatment." Queen Victoria replied, "Is that so? But Arthur Queen has reported to me that Robert Rising has never used torture during interrogations." William Gentle promptly added, "We humbly request your majesty to look into this matter carefully." Queen Victoria said, "You may all withdraw. I trust Robert Rising will conduct a thorough investigation. Once the verdict is reached, if you remain dissatisfied, you may request a change of investigator for this case." With no other choice, William Gentle led the group to take their leave from Queen Victoria. The following day, while reviewing petitions, Queen Victoria came across one written by Edward Balance, which aroused her suspicion. In his petition, Edward Balance wrote, "Currently, the ruling officials are all resentful of Charles Justice for inciting chaos. They wish to eliminate this seed of trouble, hunt down his accomplices, and urge your majesty to expand the prisons and establish stricter punishments." This was the same petition Edward Balance submitted to Queen Victoria in March of the second year of Chuegong. Within, he mentioned that officials, like Robert Rising, had fabricated accusation letters, arbitrarily arrested individuals, and even abused torture. He warned that if such practices continued, the people might rise in rebellion once again. After reading this, Queen Victoria found Edward Balance to be upright and righteous, yet seemingly unaware of her true intentions. Thus, she did not respond. At court, George Rock once again inquired about Charles Scholar's situation at the Imperial Academy. Arthur Queen quickly interjected. It is normal for Charles Scholar to be imprisoned. Perhaps due to his advanced age, his memory has weakened, and he needs time to recall everything. Queen Victoria said, then let him take his time to remember. However, he must not be detained for too long. Arthur Queen quickly agreed. When Charles Justice returned to the Imperial Academy, Wang Shueli conveyed Queen Victoria's intentions to the students. Victor Grace immediately said, I fear Sir Li cannot endure for much longer. We must act at once and first visit Sir Li. John Justice also agreed. Yes, I will ask my father to step forward and intervene. Mark Steele also said, I will seek connections to bail